Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read another poem. It's called Berenice. Mystery is manifold. The wretchedness of earth is multiform. Overreaching the wide horizon as the rainbow, its hues are various as the hues of that arch, as distinct too, yet as intimately blended. Overreaching the wide horizon as the rainbow. How is it that from beauty I have derived a type of unloveliness? From the covenant of peace, a smile of sorrow? But as in ethics, evil is a consequence of good. So, in fact, out of joy is sorrow born. Either the memory of past bliss is the anguish of today, or the agonies which have their origin in the ecstasies which might have been. My baptismal name is Agassiz. That is my family. I will not mention, yet there are no towers in the land, nor time-honored than my gloomy, gray, hereditary halls. Our line has been called a race of visionaries, and in many striking particulars, in the character of my family mansion, in the frescoes of the chief salon, in the tapestries of the dormitories, in the chiseling of some buttresses, in the armory, and more especially in the gallery of antique paintings, in the fashion of library chamber, and lastly, in the very particular nature of the library's contents, there is more than sufficient evidence to warrant the belief. The recollections of my earliest years are connected with that chamber and with its volumes, of which later I will say no more. Here died my mother. Here I was born. But it is mere idleness to say that I had not lived before, that the soul had no previous existence. You deny it? Let us not argue the matter. Convince myself, I seek not to convince. There is, however, a remembrance of aerial forms, of spiritual and meaning eyes, of sound, musical yet sad, a remembrance which will not be excluded, a memory like a shadow, vague, variable, indefinite, unsteady, and like a shadow too, in the impossibility of my getting rid of it while the sunlight of my reason shall exist. In that chamber I was born, thus awakening from the long night of what seemed was not non-entity at once into the very regions of fairyland, into a palace of imagination, into the wild dominions of monastic thought and erudition. It is not singular that I gazed around with me a startled and ardent eye, that I loitered away my boyhood in books and dissipated my youth in reverie. But it is singular that as years rolled away and the noon of manhood found me still in the mansion of my fathers, it is wonderful that stagnation there fell upon the springs of my life. Wonderful how total an inversion took place in the character of my commonest thought. The realities of the world affected me as visions, and the visions only, while the wild ideas of the land of dreams became, in turn, not the material of my everyday existence, but in very deed that existence utterly and solely in itself. Bernice and I were cousins, and we grew up together in my paternal halls, yet differently we grew. I ill of health and buried in gloom, she agile, graceful, and overflowing with energy. Hers the ramble on the hillside, mine the studies of the cloister. I living with my own heart and addicted body and soul to the most intense and painful meditation, she roamingly, carelessly through life with no thought of the shadow's inner path or the silent flight of the raven-winged hours. Berenice, I call upon her name, Berenice, and from the gray ruins of memory, a thousand tumultuous recollections of startle at that sound. Ah, vividly is her image before me now, as in early days of her lightheartedness and joy. As gorgeous yet fantastic beauty, O sylph, amid the shrubberies of Arnheim, O naiad, among its fountains, and then, then all is mystery and terror, and a tale which should not be told, disease, a fatal disease, fell like the simoon upon her frame. and even while I gazed upon her, the spirit of change wept over her, pervading her mind, her habits, and her character, and in a manner of most subtle and terrible, disturbing even the identity of her person. Alas, the destroyer came and went, and the victim, where was she? I knew her not, or know her no longer as Bernice. Among the numerous train of maladies and superinduced by the fatal and primary one, which effected a revolution so horrible, a kind in the moral and physical being of my cousin, may be mentioned as the most distressing and obstinate of its nature, a species of epilepsy. I have epilepsy, and I'm reading a story about epilepsy. Not unfrequently terminating in trance itself, trance very nearly resembling positive dissolution, and from which her manner of recovery was, in most instances, startlingly abrupt. And in the meantime, my own disease, for I have been told that I should call it by no other appellation, my own disease, then grew rapidly upon me and assumed finally a monomaniac character of a novel and extraordinary form, hourly and momentarily gaining vigor and at length obtaining over me most incomprehensible ascendancy. This monomania, if I must so term it, considered in a morbid irritability of those properties of the mind in metaphysical science termed the attentive, it is more than probable that I am not understood. But I fear, indeed, that it is no matter possible to convey to the mind of the merely general reason an adequate idea of that nervous intensity of interest with which, in my case, the powers of meditation, not to speak technically, busied and buried themselves in the contemplation of even the most ordinary objects of the universe. To muse for long, unwearied hours with my attention riveted to some frivolous device in the margin or in the topography of a book, to become absorbed in the better part of a summer's day in a quaint shallow falling aslant from the tapestry or upon the door, to lose myself for an entire night in watching the steady flame of a lamp or the embers of a fire, to dream away whole days over the perfume of a flower, to repeat monotonously some common word until the sound, by dint of frequent repetition, ceased to convey any idea whatever to the mind, to lose all sense of motion or physical existence by means of absolute bodily quiescence, long and obstinately perversed in. Such were a few of the most common and least pernicious vagaries induced by a condition of the mental faculties, not indeed altogether unparalleled, but certainly biting defiance to anything like analysis or explanation. Yet let me not be misapprehended. The undue earnest and morbid attention thus excited by objects in their own nature frivolous must not be confounded in character with that ruminating propensity common to all mankind, and more especially indulged in the persons of art and imagination. It was not even, as might be first supposed, an extreme condition or exaggeration of such propensity, but primarily and essentially distinct and different. And in one instance, the dreamer or enthusiast, being interested in the object, usually not frivolous, imperceptibly loses sight of the object in the wilderness of deductions and suggestions issuing therefrom, until, at the conclusion of the daydream, often replete with luxury, he finds the instrumentarium of the first cause of his musings entirely vanished and forgotten. In my case, the primary object was invariably frivolous, although assuming through the medium of my distempered vision a refracted and unreal importance. Few deductions, if any, were made, and very few perniciously, returning in upon the original object as the center. The meditations were never pleasurable, and at the termination of the reverie, the first cause, so far from being out of sight, had attained the supernaturally exaggerated interest which was the prevailing feature of the disease. In a word, the powers of mind, more particular exercise, were with me, as I have said before, the attentive, and are with the daydreamer, the speculative. My book is this epoch, as they did not exactly serve to irritate and disorder partook, it will be perceived largely as their imaginative and inconsequential nature of the characteristic qualities of the disorder itself. I will remember, among others, the treatise of the noble Italian Coriolis Secundus de Curio, occupied by undivided time and by many weeks of laborious and fruitless investigation. Thus, it will appear that, shaken from its balance only by trivial things, my reason bore resemblance of that ocean crag spoken by the Polmi Hefison, which, steadily resisting the attacks of human violence and the fiery fury of the waters and the winds, trembling only to the touch of the flower called aphrodel, and although to a careless thinker it might appear a matter beyond doubt that the alteration produced by the unhappy melody of the moral condition of Berenice would afford me many objects for this exercise of that intense and abnormal meditation whose nature I have been at some troubling in explaining, yet was not in any degree the case. In the lucid intervals of my infirmity, her calamity indeed gave me pain, and taking deeply to heart the total wreck of her fair and gentle life, I did not fail to ponder frequently and bitterly upon the wonder-working means by which so strange a revolution had been so suddenly brought to pass. But these reflections partook not of the idiosyncrasy of my disease, and were such as would have occurred under similar circumstances to the ordinary mass of mankind. True to its own character, my disorder reveled in its less important but more startling changes wrought in the physical frame of Berenice, but more startling changes in the singular and most appalling distortion of her personal identity during the brightest days of her unparalleled beauty. Most surely I have never loved her. In the strange anomaly of my existence, feelings with me had never been of the heart, and my passions always were of the mind. Through the gray of the early morning, among the trellised shadows of the forest at noonday, and in the silence of my library at night, she had flitted by my eyes, and I had seen her, not as the living and breathing Berenice, but as the Berenice of a dream, not as a being of the earth, earthly, but as an abstraction of a being, not as a thing to admire, but to analyze, not as an object of love, but as the theme of the most abstruse, altogether desultory speculation. And now that I have shuddered in her presence and grew pale at her approach, yet bitterly lamenting her fallen and desolate condition, I called to mind that she had loved me long, and in an evil moment I spoke of her of marriage. And at length the period of our nuptials was approaching, when upon an afternoon in the winter of that year, one of those unseasonably warm, calm, and misty days which are the nurse of the beautiful halcyon, I sat as I thought alone, in the inner apartment of that library, but uplifting my eyes, I saw Berenice stood before me. It was my own excited imagination, or the misty influence of the atmosphere, or the uncertain twilight of the chamber, or the great draperies which fell around her figure, which caused in it so vacillating and indistinct an outline. I could not tell. She spoke no word, and I, no for worlds, could have uttered a syllable. An icy chill ran through my frame. A sense of insufferable anxiety oppressed me. A consuming curiosity prevailed my soul. And sinking back upon the chair, I remained for some time breathless and motionless, with my eyes riveted upon her person. Alas, its emanation and was excessive, and not one vestige of the former being lurked into any single line of the contour. My burning glances at length fell upon the face. The forehead was high and very pale, the singular placid, and the one jetty hair fell partially over it and overshadowed the holly temples with the numeral ringlets, now of a vivid yellow and jarring discordantly in their fantastic character with the reigning melancholy of the countenance. The eyes were lifeless and lusterless and seemingly pupilless, and I shrank involuntarily from their glassy stare to the contemplation of the thin and shrunken lips. They parted, and in a smile of particular meaning, the teeth of the changed Berenice disclosed themselves slowly to my view. Would to God that I have never beheld them, or that, have done so, I had died. The shutting of a door disturbed me, and looked up, I found that my cousin had departed from the chamber. But from the disordered chamber of my brain, not alas, departed, and I would not be driven away, the white ghastly spectrum of the teeth, not a speck on their surface, not a shade on their enamel, not an indenture of their edges, but what that period of her smile had sufficed to brand in upon my memory. I saw them now even more unequivocally than I beheld them then. The teeth, the teeth. They were here and there and everywhere, and visibly and palpably before me, long, narrow, and excessively white, with the pale lips writhing about them as in the very moment of their first terrible development. And came the full fury of my monomania, and I struggled in vain against it, strange and irresistible influence. In the multiplied objects of the external world, I had no thoughts but for the teeth. In these I longed for the frenzied desire. All other matters and all other different interests became absorbed in their single contemplation. They alone were present in the mental eye, and they, in their sole individuality, became the essence of my mental life. I held them in every light. I turned them in every attitude. I surveyed their characteristics. I dwelt upon their peculiarities. I pondered upon their conformation. I mused upon their alteration in their nature. I shuddered as I assigned to them the imagination a sensitive and sentient power, and even when unassisted by the lips, a capability of moral expression, of Saleh. It had been well said of Bernice. I more seriously believed it was that I coveted them so madly. I felt that their possession could be alone ever restore me to peace, in giving me back to reason. And an evening closed in upon me thus, and then the darkness came and tarried and went, and the day again dawned, and the mist of the second night was now gathering round, and I sat motionless in that solitary room, and still I sat buried in meditation, and still the phantasma of the teeth maintained its terrible ascendancy, as with the most vivid and hideous distinctness it floated about amid the changing lights and shadow of the chamber. At length there broke in upon my dreams a cry as a horror and dismay, and thereunto, after a pause, succeeded the sound of troubled voices, intermingled with many low moanings of sorrow or in pain. I arose from my seat, and throwing open one of the doors of the library, saw standing out in the antechamber a servant maiden, all in tears, who told me that Bernice was no more. She had been seized with epilepsy in the early morning, and now at the closing and in the night, the grave was ready for its tenant, and all the preparations for the burial were completed. I found myself sitting in the library, and again sitting there alone. It seemed that I had newly awakened from a confused and excited dream. I knew that it was now midnight, and I was well aware that since the setting of the sun, Berenice had been interred. But of that dreary period which intervened, and I had no positive, at least no definitive comprehension, yet its memory was replete with horror more horrible than being vague, and terrible more terrible than ambiguity. It was a fearful page, and in the record of my existence, written all over the dim and hideous and unintelligible recollections. I tried to decipher them, but in vain, ever while and anon, like the spirit of the departed sound and shrill and piercing shriek of a female voice seeming to be ringing in my ears. I had done a deed. What was it? I asked myself the question aloud, and the whispering echoes of the chamber answered me. What was it? On the table beside me burned a lamp, and near it lay a little box. It was of no remarkable character, and I had seen it frequently before, for it was a property of the family physician. But how came it there upon my table, and why did I shudder it regarding it? These things were in no matter to be accounted for, and my eyes at length dropped to the open page of the book and to a sentence underscored wherein the words were a singular but simple ones of a poet Ibn Zayat. Why then was I perused them? Did the hairs of my head erect themselves on end, and the blood of my body become congealed with my veins? There came a light tap at the library door, and a pale as the tenant of the tomb, a menial entered upon tiptoe. His looks were wild with terror, and he spoke to me in a voice tremulous, husky, and very low. What said he? Some broken sentence I heard? He told me of a wild cry disturbing the silence of the night, of the gathering together of the household, of a search in the direction of the sound. And then his tones grew thrillingly distant as he whispered me a violated grave, of a disfigured body enshrouded, yet still breathing, still palpitating, still alive. He pointed to my garments. They were muddy and clotted with gore. I spoke not, and he took me gently by the hand. It was indented with the impress of human nails. He directed my attention to some object against the wall. I looked at it for some minutes. It was a spade. With a shriek, I bound to the table and grasped the box that lay upon it, but I could not force it open, and in my tremor it slipped from my hands and fell heavily and burst into pieces. And from it, with a rattling sound, there rolled out from an instrument of dental surgery, intermingled with 32 small white ivory-looking substances that were scattered to and fro about the floor. That is the end of Berenice. If you enjoyed it or think there's any truth in poetry or what I or Poe am saying here, please like, subscribe, and share, and have a nice day, and God bless the children.